You do you remember how many vehicles were parked in the driveway when you got there?
One.
When you arrived at the house and you got off your bike, what did you do?
I laid my bike down in the driveway, and I took my backpack off, and I took out the box that had been gift wrapped, that had an end open, and I put the .22 revolver in that box. And I put the backpack back on my back, and I took a bunch of roses, and I walked up to the door and I rang the doorbell. And I was shaking and freaking out at this point because there was nowhere I wanted to be less than at that house on that morning. And when I rang the doorbell, the door opened and a woman came to the front. And I thought it was Christina Parcell, but I wanted to make sure. And I also wanted to make sure that no one else was home. So I told her that while I was holding the box and the roses, that I had a delivery for Christina Parcell, her sister. And she told me that Christina wasn't home. So at this point, I realized that Christina was at the house alone. And I handed her the roses, and I took the revolver out of the box, and I pointed it at her, and I told her to be quiet and to go back into the house, which she did. And I followed her into the house, and I shut the door. And I was experiencing such anxiety that my body wasn't really doing what I was telling it to do anymore. Like when I realized that I couldn't use the gun, which was unloaded at this point, my plan had been to try to knock her unconscious because I didn't want to cause her or anyone any pain. That wasn't my intention. I just wanted to save Aida and to make sure that no one else who was a bystander would be involved in this or could be endangered in any way. So I tried, while she was holding the roses, to strike her on the head and knock her unconscious. But my body was fighting me because even though I knew who she was and what she was doing and the danger that was putting Aida in, I was still looking at her and I was seeing a sympathetic figure. I was seeing a woman, and I had always been taught never to hurt a woman, to always protect women and children. So when I went to strike her with the gun, my hand didn't really do what I was trying to tell it to. I essentially pulled my strike. It felt like a time I had been cliff jumping with friends. I have a big fear of heights, and there was a 30-foot face that you could jump off and jump into a deep pool of water, and when I would run up to the edge, I would try to get a running start and jump off the edge, and I just couldn't. Like my body would stop me against my will. And I had to try to do this 10 or 15 or 20 times before I could actually get myself to go over the edge. So when I struck her on the head with the pistol, that's what happened. It didn't knock her unconscious, and I hardly struck her at all, to be honest. So I tried again, and the same thing happened. I just couldn't bring myself to strike her. And at this point, she realized that I was hesitating, and she began to try to move herself and to get away and to fight back. And during this period of time, the roses had dropped and the petals and stems had scattered. And as I was hesitating, I realized that this situation was quickly getting out of control. And if I didn't pull myself together and act soon. This was all going to, because what was happening to her would never be uncovered.
Zach, I'm sorry, just a quick question. You heard testimony that at this time, Christina weighed 163 pounds. How much did you weigh on October the 13th?
160.
Go ahead.
So I realized that I was going to have to somehow force myself to do this at any cost. So I pulled out the knife I was wearing. And even though I knew I wasn't going to be able to strike her with any amount of force, I still tried. So I started striking her, though my strikes were pulled. And I think the knife made contact with her, but it wasn't stopping her, and it wasn't inflicting anything that could be a fatal blow.
Okay, so that might explain the 31 stab wounds all around the head and neck. Still with us, criminal defense attorney Marie Pereira and former deputy public defender Philip Dubé. Philip, I want to go back to this idea of imperfect self-defense. Are you suggesting that perhaps the judge might have erred in not allowing the defense to be able to claim some form of imperfect self-defense?
Yes, I genuinely mean that. Not perfect self-defense, mind you, because there was no evidence, not one shred of evidence, that there was going to be imminent harm to anybody in that home, let alone death. The imperfect self-defense is satisfied if he simply takes a stand and gives any type of testimony that he personally, honestly believed in the need to use deadly force. But the next aspect of it for the jury is to decide whether or not his belief in the need to use deadly force was reasonable. So it goes from the subjective to the objective aspect. And I could see a jury coming back on an imperfect self-defense. They're all going to agree that this young man is nuts, that he's crazed. He might have honestly believed that in his deluded mind, but objectively to us as this jury of 12, his belief is unreasonable and we can give him manslaughter. That would be a huge victory because I believe it caps at 30 years as opposed to life. He's still a young guy. What is he, 32, 33 years old? So there would be light at the end of the tunnel if he could get that instruction.
Yeah, the judge ultimately decided, he's the gatekeeper of evidence, he decided that would be unreasonable and confusing to the jury to allow that in because it just didn't fit the facts. Marie, the one thing he can't get away from, and he's trying to hear with the testimony we're listening to now, from the brutality of this crime, saying he's trying to protect someone, but yet this was an extremely brutal crime.
He knew exactly what he was doing. He premeditatedly planned the entire thing. He even thought to have a silencer. He tortured the woman. What I'm getting from this testimony is the aggravated nature of what he did. And I don't even understand how we're talking self-defense. From what I remember from when I was a crim law teaching assistant, there has to be an imminent threat against your own life or the life of someone else that's happening right now. How did that woman opening the door and seeing him there holding a gun and then him stabbing her, torturing her, threaten his own life? Where does that come in?
It doesn't.
Why are we even talking about
doesn't.
self-defense?
All right, Marie, sorry to cut you off. I got to take a break. Coming up, more from defendant Zachary Hughes, so keep it here on Court TV. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Michael Ayala. We are tracking several major trials this afternoon here at Court TV. In South Carolina, defendant Zachary Hughes has taken the stand in his own defense in the Rose Petal murder trial. He's accused of brutally stabbing to death his friend's ex-girlfriend, but Hughes says there's more to the story, and boy, has he been telling it on the stand. And in California, the state's case continues in a celebrity stylist murder trial where defendant Monica Cementelli is accused of conspiring with her lover to kill her husband for the insurance money. We're going to get you into that courtroom in just a bit, but for now, I want to head back to South Carolina, where defendant Zachary Hughes is still on the stand. He's telling the story of the actual murder. Let's go back inside.
And she started to fight back. She realized I was hesitating, and it became a struggle. And in this struggle, all I could do was try to overcome this resistance I had towards doing this thing. Even though I knew it was right, I still had this physical and emotional resistance to doing it. So I just kept striking her until finally we fell on the floor. And at this point, I had just tried to take my mind out of it and just try to get through this and finish it as quickly as possible, because I realized that it was only becoming prolonged, and I had to. So I don't remember how many times I struck her. I just remember that when it finished, we were on the ground, and I stopped striking her when she stopped struggling. And at this point, I stood up, and I was still freaking out, and I was in kind of a daze. And I was just trying to pull myself together and figure out what I needed to do to leave the house. And again, I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave anything behind that would connect me to it, because then I believe John would be connected to it, and it would only in danger, because I didn't know if Christina Parcell was the only person involved. And she wasn't. So I quickly looked around to make sure I hadn't left a mask or a glove, and I started to pick up the rose petals and realized that I just didn't have time to do that. Again, I was concerned that a neighbor might have heard the commotion and that a neighbor might come by to investigate, and I didn't want that. So I drew the blinds and I moved her body away from the door, which had windows, because I didn't want someone to come to the door and see her. And I put my things back in the backpack, and I looked in a mirror before I left to make sure everything was in order, and I saw that she had scratched my face in the struggle. And of course, I realized that this could leave DNA. So I used the paint thinner to try to clean her hands. And then I changed my mask, and I took off my outer shirt because there was blood on it. And I put it in the backpack. And at this point, I was really worried that someone, that Lutina might come back to the house, or Brad Post might come to the house, or a neighbor might come over. So I was trying to leave the house as quickly as possible. And before I left, when I realized that I had probably left my DNA there, despite my effort not to, I prayed again and just said that I believe that what I've done is the right thing, and I believe that I did it for the right reason. But if it's your will that I be connected to this, then I will turn myself in, and I will own up to what I've done, and I'll take responsibility for it, because I believed that it was the right thing. And then I left. I exited out through the door, and I got back on my bike, and I pedaled my bike back to the truck, and I drove back to the mountain house. And I was still completely freaking out, and it felt entirely surreal. But there's a big difference in how I felt, in that as soon as I left the house, I felt the most enormous wave of relief wash over me, because I knew from that moment on sexual abuse that her mother was perpetrating on her. And there is proof to that the state is hiding from you.
Your Honor, instruct him to be quiet. Okay, you need to stop talking. The jury, please take it.